Welcome back to A New Dawn, the inspiring message of the book of Revelation. In this series of studies, we're looking together at the big picture message of the last book of the Bible and how it provides such hope and inspiration for a church in a season of struggle. You know, when the church faces times of difficulty, it usually responds in one of three ways. Churches will either retreat, they will settle, or they will advance even amid the difficulty. In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, the Lord Himself writes a series of letters to the persecuted church, and He encourages us to advance in faith even amid difficulty and not to retreat in fear. I think that comes through in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 21. That's somewhat of a key verse for our study in this session. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on His throne. During times of war and conflict, letters are often your only connection with home. For members of the armed forces, like during World War II, letters from home were second only to food. I mean, imagine being in a time of war, feeling like you're on the losing end of the battle, and you're almost ready to give up, and then you get a letter from home, from a loved one, that makes you want to continue going. Better yet, imagine getting a letter that comes from the commander of the entire army that details that the battle has almost been won on almost every front, so don't retreat, but advance forward. You know, letter writing has almost become a lost art today, and yet, even in our digital age, there is something powerful about receiving a letter. Letter writing takes time. You got to be intentional with your words. You kind of give yourself away in writing. And as a letter, when you write a letter, it gives tangible proof that there's somebody somewhere who's thinking about you. Letter writing requires time and attention and communicates closeness between two people who are far away. It also has a way of defining relationships. I think we see all of this here in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, where God writes this letter from heaven to the church. In the letter, He gives proof that He cares for us and He wants what's best for us. And best of all, He wants us to know that even in the heat of the battles of life, victory has already been won. Now, when we see these letters from the Lord, I think in the first place we see a place where heaven and earth meet. Each of the churches, the 7 churches that Jesus addresses in these 2 chapters, is first addressed to the angel of that particular congregation. Now, in the Greek text, it's literally a messenger. It could be an angelic messenger or a human messenger. The context really doesn't tell us. So some interpreters think that it's discussing the evangelists of the local congregation. That's who's being addressed. Those are the messengers. But could it be that John is referring to literal angels watching over the churches? The visionary context of the book of Revelation and the frequent references to the book of Daniel, like in Daniel chapter 10, verses 13 through 14, maybe these are in fact angels that are commissioned over churches, represented as stars in the heavens, Revelation 1 and verse 20. Heavenly and earthly realms, you see, have an interconnection to them. The church, what's going on with the church on earth is very much a part of a much broader picture of things that are happening on a spiritual plane. So a message that goes to the church on earth also perhaps goes to the church's angel in heaven. Nevertheless, the church is where heaven and earth meet. The church is the epicenter for divine activity in this world. More than our immediate physical circumstances, we're part of a spiritual warfare that's taking place in heavenly realms. That great truth becomes sharply apparent throughout the book of Revelation. The letter is addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor. In reality, there were more than 7 churches in that geographical area, like Hierapolis and Colossae, that aren't mentioned, but Jesus picks these 7. Well, why 7? 7 represents completeness and stands for all the churches of that time and even all churches throughout all time. Each church is represented as a lampstand, chapter 1 and verse 20. Now when you think of a lampstand, lampstands have flames, and the flame represents the vibrancy and health of every church. Jesus walks among those lampstands, inspecting those flickering flames, or the spiritual status of the churches, chapter 2 and verse 1. You see, Jesus walks among us, and He knows the reality of our spiritual health, both individually and congregationally. We can often fool ourselves into thinking that we're something we're not, and churches can often live in denial about their true spiritual condition, but Jesus is outside the bubble, and He can objectively analyze the health of every individual Christian and every church. And here He gives a progress report to each of these gatherings. Each time when He says, gives that instruction about how they're doing, He says, if you have ears, listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. You see, He warns that if we don't honestly look at ourselves and our progress, we may end up finding that our flame has been snuffed out and our lampstand removed. Not only do these letters represent the place where heaven and earth meet, but also where direction meets correction. Churches die when they refuse to make corrections. We usually are most resistant of making healthy changes when we're afraid. The church will always face difficult circumstances, and there'll always be times when Christians suffer. But as we saw in the last lesson, the Lord of history tells us in the first chapter of this book, fear not. Jesus gives specific instructions to each of these representative churches. And He says, even though you're facing persecution, don't run, don't hide, don't retreat, and don't be paralyzed by fear. Instead, advance. Don't be afraid of going too far. Be afraid of not going far enough in faith. Even in the midst of uncertain times, Jesus pleads with the church to not retreat, but to advance. He pleads with the church to move forward, to move beyond merely standing for the truth and fall in love with Jesus. He says to Ephesus, I know that you can't bear those who are evil, but you have lost your first love. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. He pleads with the church to develop and to move beyond fear and begin walking in confident faith. He says to Smyrna, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Be faithful until death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. He pleads with the church to expand and move beyond commitment to Jesus and to do more than just that, but embrace a complete healthy teaching. He says to Pergamum, you hold fast to my name, and you do not deny my faith, but some of you hold to the teaching of Balaam and practice sexual immorality, and hold to the heretical teaching of the Nicolaitans, chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. He pleads with the church to mature and move beyond simply tolerating everything and start practicing wise discernment about what people do and say. He says to Thyatira, I know your works, your love and your faith and service and your patient endurance, but you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants. Chapter 2, verses 18 through 29. He pleads with the church to progress and move beyond the traditions and victories of the past and be alive and active today. He says to Sardis, you have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. He pleads with the church to innovate and move beyond dreams and potential and put your faith into action. He says to Philippi, I have set before you, an open door which no one can shut. And he's implying they should walk through it. Chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. He pleads with the church to improve and move beyond apathy and get passionate for advancing the cause. He says to Laodicea, you're neither cold nor hot, you're lukewarm. I stand at the door and knock. Open the door. Chapter 3, verses 14 through 22. So these letters represent the place where heaven and earth meet, where direction meets correction, and finally where faithfulness meets victory. What do you do when a storm is brewing? Well, some people board up the windows and leave town, but there are others who get aboard and go surfing. For conservative people, we tend to think of boarding up the windows and waiting out the storm as being the safe thing to do. But Jesus is not calling the church to take such an approach. He tells us to go into the storm and advance against the darkness. Each time He tells the church to conquer, over and over again. You see it in chapter 2 in verses 7, 11, 17, and 26, and in chapter 3, verses 5, 12, and 21. Over and over again, He tells the church to conquer, to go out into the surf. Take your lampstand into the darkness. Don't be afraid of the darkness, but push it back with the power of the light. For many of us, this seems dangerous and foolhardy even. It would be foolish if we were doing it on our own initiative. But this is a mandate from the King. This is a telegraph to the troops. This is a letter from the Lord. We're not alone in the storm. As we take our lampstand and walk into the darkness, the one who holds the 7 stars and walks among the lampstands is with us. Jesus promises you and me that if we'll be faithful and not retreat from the storm, but advance in faith, that our victory is certain. He promises that the church that moves forward will eat from the tree of life, chapter 2 and verse 7. The church that develops will receive a crown of life and not be hurt by the second death, chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. He promises the church that expands will eat from the hidden manna and will have its name engraved on a white stone, chapter 2 and verse 17. The one that matures will have authority over the nations and will be given the morning star, chapter 2, 26 through 28. He promises that the church that progresses will be clothed in white garments, chapter 3 and verse 5. He promises that the church that innovates will be made into a pillar in the temple of God, chapter 3 and verse 12. He promises that the church that is improving will be granted to sit with Jesus on His throne, chapter 3 and verse 21. During wars like World War II, letters played a significant role in maintaining morale on the battlefront and even at home. The Lord is very aware of the reality that we are engaged in a spiritual war. He knows what the church is dealing with in every age, and He knows what we're dealing with right now. He knows that we have a tendency for our morale to drop and for our hearts to become discouraged in times like these. And so He wrote us some letters. And in those letters, He gives us a glimpse into the future and the end of the conflict. With the flags of victory waving, He shows us the dawning of a new day. He hopes to inspire you and me, to show us that victory is certain, and to show us that in the meantime, we must not retreat in fear in the conflict. Rather, we must advance ahead. Some of the key concepts in this lesson were these. The church is the epicenter of divine activity in the world. More than immediate physical circumstances, we're part of a spiritual warfare taking place in heavenly places. Second, Jesus walks among us. He knows the reality of our spiritual health as a church. Thirdly, churches die when they refuse to make corrections. Even in the midst of uncertain times, Jesus pleads with the church to advance and not retreat. Fourth, Jesus promises that victory is certain for those who are faithful and do not retreat during times of difficulty. I hope that you've enjoyed this session of A New Dawn, and I hope that you'll come back next time as we move into chapter 4 and we see this inspiring message from the book of Revelation that provides such hope for believers during a time like this.